The following program is brought to you by We Are Many. To learn more about this program or to find others like it, check out wearemany.org.
I think it's worth beginning a teach-in like this. First of all, by saying Happy Record Store Day to everyone. I wish I could say that we deliberately scheduled this teach-in to be on Record Store Day, but I only noticed that last night. So happy Record Store Day to everyone. Still rather apropos, I suppose. One of those happy accidents of history. And I think it's also worth beginning a teach-in like this by simply reminding ourselves of the sheer amount of musicians, bands, recording artists who over the past several months have come out in support of the Occupy movement. Keep in mind, when I say this, I mean all artists who have performed at an Occupy encampment, written songs about Occupy, or simply spoken in support of the movement. Pitching it very broadly like this, I think compiling a list of all of those types of artists is pretty impossible. Nonetheless, I'm going to attempt to do so right now. So, first we have Tom Morello and Zach De La Rocha of Rage Against the Machine, of course. Lupe Fiasco, obviously. Pete Seeger, Bruce Springsteen. Immortal Technique, Talib Kweli, Lou Reed, Ani DeFranco, Dead Prez, Pearl Jam, David Rovics, Ozomatli, Antibalas Afrobeat Orchestra, Devo, Yola Tango, David Crosby, Radiohead, Massive Attack, Stefan Said, Third Eye Blind, who, I have to be honest, I didn't even know were still around, Bun B, Saul Williams, Sharon Jones, Dee Antwoord, Nas, The Beastie Boys, Billy Bragg, Kim Yaw Dawson, Trent Reznor, DJ Shadow, Das Racist, Propagandhi, Michael Franti and Spearhead, Kim Gordon, Lee Ronaldo and Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth, Daniel Rosen from Grizzly Bear, Cliff Skurlock from The Flaming Lips, Meryl Garbus from Tune Yards, Kip Malone from TV on the Radio, Ryan Harvey, Evan Greer, and Mark Gunnery of the Riot Folk Collective, Dave Allen from Gang of Four, former members of Jurassic 5, Atari Teenage Riot, Fugazi, including Ian MacKaye and Guy Picciotto, Wayne Kramer, formerly of the MC5, Amy Klein, formerly of Titus Andronicus, Kanye West, Russell Simmons, and even Katy Perry and Miley fucking Cyrus. That's over 50 artists I just named right there. I haven't even mentioned a fraction of all the different artists who have signed up on the website occupymusicians.org, or all the artists who are going to appear on the upcoming Occupy Music compilation. I haven't even scratched the surface of how many musicians with national or international followings have supported the Occupy movement in one way or another, and let alone the artists with regional or local followings or underground followings who have played small fundraisers or impromptu street corner performances during marches, things like that. Now, I'm not going through this laborious list just for its own sake. Rather, I think it's worth reminding ourselves once again of just how widespread the response to Occupy among musicians and artists has been, regardless of what their motivations are. And I think there's certainly bound to be more than a few opportunists, even among the short list that I laid out. It reflects the massive sea change in politics and in American society and world society that our movement and others like it has really provoked. I mean, let's be honest, Miley Cyrus is the lowest common denominator of music. You know, her music is, this isn't a judgment. Well, it is a little bit, but her music is trite, it lacks even the most basic substance, but it's easily marketable, it's easily sold, and it's easily consumed. It is, in a nutshell, the personification of what I think the 1% want music to be. But when even she is recording songs like Liberty Walk, which came out several months back, it's this syrupy, unlistenable song, but it openly supports Occupy. You know, and it reflects, I think, because of that, I think it reflects just how far our potential to shift consciousness reaches. I think the outpouring among artists and musicians is profoundly significant. And I think it's significant because this is the largest number of artists and musicians to openly ally with the social movement since the 1960s. There have certainly been examples like this before. I mean, plenty of artists that came out against the Iraq War in support of immigrant rights over the past decade, but none of it has been on the sheer level that Occupy has brought out once again since the 1960s. And I admit that this is actually a bold statement to make in some ways. You know, I better be ready to back this up, because I think we've all been raised on these very iconic sounds and images of the 1960s. You know, many of them are quite romantic, too. You know, like long-haired hippies dancing to Janis Joplin and Jefferson Airplane, anti-war protests being set to the sound of Jimi Hendrix's Purple Haze, Bob Dylan playing at civil rights marches, the Black Panthers, Woodstock. You know, for as potent as this imagery is, and I think it most certainly is potent, it's also very hazy in the way that it's presented to us when it's taught to us. On the one hand, I think the positive is that even the most sanitized version of the history books will admit that culture and politics in the 1960s absolutely went hand in hand. But on the other hand, it's never really explored why this is the case. You know, we're left with this notion that somehow, well, those were the times, and then we can just sort of, you know, put it behind us and dismiss it and put it in the past. Or we're left with this idea that somehow it's music and art that just inspires people by itself to struggle and fight back. And so that because artists lead the people, somehow, therefore the right art can just mobilize the people, that somehow we just haven't gotten the formula correct yet. It's a position, basically, that I think is distilled nowadays in a couple ways. One is when I think people ask, you know, where is our generation's Bob Dylan or Joan Baez? And the other is actually one that I hear a lot more often nowadays from younger progressive artists, which is that my art is my activism. I've had that said to me a bunch ever since I became a music journalist and an activist. And I actually see that as a problematic thing to say. Not because I think that art has no role to play in the world, though. I mean, everyone who's here today is obviously here because they have some sense that art or music has a role to play, that music is very important to us, and art in general is very important to us, and it absolutely has a role to play in changing the world. Rather, I say that arts as activism is problematic because the relationship between music and politics is just a lot more complex. I think that music, and for that matter, all art, absolutely serves the function of inspiring people. It touches us as human beings in a place that's just more instinctual and emotional that intellectual ideas can't really describe. I think the fact that you can't really describe what it is the music or a good piece of art does to you emotionally speaks to its raw power. You know, music and art, once again, are as old as humanity itself. And so that tells us that it has to fulfill some sort of primal need in us as human beings. And because it's something that's meant to be shared also, it's something that's meant to be created in a social atmosphere, I think it also can naturally present a sense of camaraderie and solidarity among people, because it's something that can be shared and created in a social environment. For this same reason, though, I think it has to be acknowledged that music is very much shaped by the time and place in which it's made, and the balance of material forces that prevail during the time, which once again have a big effect on what happens in music. I mean, let's step back and think about this. The same forces that decide which stories are focused on by the media, the same forces that allow schools to be shut down while banks are bailed out, that doesn't have enough money to keep folks in homes but somehow has plenty to spend on war, that's also a general society in which music is operating right now. Music as an art form, I think, is exploited, just like all walks of life for the 99% and for the working class here in the United States and on the planet in general. Now, obviously, if something is exploited, it can't reach its full potential. I mean, that's the nature of exploitation. And at a quick glance, if you take a quick glance at the music industry, you'll actually start to get an idea of just what this exploitation looks like and how it goes down. And I'm going to lay out a few facts here that really bust a lot of myths about the way that the music industry operates here in the U.S. Fact one, Over 70% of all music sold on the planet is released and owned by 4 major labels. 70%, 4 labels. Sony, Warner Brothers, Universal Music Group, and EMI. And if a merger between EMI and Universal Music Group is approved, it'll be down to 3. These labels are themselves owned by some truly evil companies. And I'm not kidding when I say evil. EMI is owned by Citigroup. So the same people that actually own my student loans, for example, are also for a while put out Radiohead. Warner Music Group is owned by an oil conglomerate who are themselves half owned by British Petroleum. So think about that. The money that is made off of artists on the Warner Music Group label is also basically ending up in the same hands that single-handedly ruined the Gulf of Mexico 2 years ago. Similarly, the lion's share of terrestrial radio is owned by a small handful of companies here in the United States. This actually isn't a buried fact. It's quite well known. This is mostly thanks to the deregulation of radio with the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And the biggest of these companies is, of course, Clear Channel, who are infamous for their right-wing views, like blackballing the Dixie Chicks after their anti-war comments in 2003, banning over 160 songs from being played on the air after 9/11, much, much more. Fact 3, last year Obama's Justice Department approved the merger between Ticketmaster and Live Nation, despite overwhelming evidence that each company has a long history of price gouging. This merger, which resulted in the creation of Live Nation Entertainment, essentially creates a monopoly in the live music scene, particularly in the United States. And already in the past 15 years, concert ticket prices have gone up by 60%. We can guarantee that that's going to go up even more in the coming years now that Live Nation Entertainment has really consolidated itself. And so from those 3 facts that I laid out right there, it's obvious that the 1% who controls most of the economy already also control the music business. And this disparity, I think, is made even more criminal when one compares their reality, the reality of the people who own the music industry, with the people who actually make the music. If you compare those 2 lifestyles, then you start to actually see what the reality of this exploitation is once again. For example, the average yearly income of the CEOs of the big 4 major record labels that I mentioned earlier is $5 million. The average yearly income of a professional musician is $41,000. Most musicians are expected to pay for recording and touring out of their initial advance after they sign their record contract, and it's only after this advance is paid that they see any royalties from their albums. And even then, it's normally an average of 12%, 15% at the most. For every $1,000 worth of music that is sold out there, musicians see on average $23. $1,000, $23. The percentage of musicians who have sufficient health insurance, 4%. That's not an exaggeration. 96% of people who identify as working musicians for their primary source of income are either uninsured or underinsured. And, well, as we know in this country, that the dangers of that is just, the toll is indescribable often. Most recording artists also aren't in a union that defends their interests when recording contracts are negotiated. You know, many are in the American Federation of Musicians, or they're in AFTRA, the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, but these unions are designed for orchestras, session musicians, or of course television and radio. Currently, there is no organization in the US designed to protect recording artists against the exploitation of major labels. Now, I don't know if people saw the I Am the 99% photo that came out from Lester Chambers. He was formerly of the Chambers Brothers, who were a big act back in the 1960s. But his story is actually not uncommon. Just to be clear, once again, you know, Lester Chambers is no lightweight. The Chambers Brothers wrote probably one of the most iconic songs of the 1960s, Time Has Come Today. It's one of those songs that you're never quite sure what song people are describing until you hear it on the radio and you say, oh yeah, I've heard this. I've heard it plenty of times. And, you know, it was a big hit song. It went gold, as a matter of fact, as did the album it was on. But here's what Lester Chambers told the world in his photo. I am the former lead singer of a 60s band. I performed before thousands at Atlanta Pop, Miami Pop, Newport Pop, and Atlantic Pop, the festivals. I did not squander my money on drugs or a fancy home. I went from 1967 to 1994 before I saw my first royalty check. The music giants I recorded with only paid me for 7 of my albums. I have never seen a penny in royalties from my other 10 albums I recorded. Our hit song was licensed to over 100 films, TV shows, and radio commercials without our permission. One major TV network used our song for a national commercial, and my payment was $625. I am now 72, trying to live on $1,200 a month. Sweet Relief, a music charity, is taking donations for me. Only the 1% of artists can afford to sue. I am the 99%. Once again, it's no exaggeration to say that the labels the Lester Chambers recorded for have made millions of dollars off of his music. And yet when Chambers was diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago, he had to rely on donations in order to pay his medical bills. There's a word for this once again, and it is exploitation. Despite this image that artists live in a charmed Hollywood existence in this kind of bubble that's separated off from the rest of working people, most are just barely scraping by in order to survive. And most are also rather powerless when they try to take on a major record label. And this, of course, affects the content of the music itself. You know, labels are in a very powerful position to basically say to artists, well, we think your lyrics are too political, temper it down some, or your sound's not marketable enough, so we're not releasing your album. This is essentially a recipe not for maintaining music, not for pushing it forward, certainly, but basically for holding it back, for keeping it in chains. And if you think about any groundbreaking art that you have ever, be it a painting or a piece of music or a poem or anything, it had to take a risk in order to, it had to violate some kind of rule in order to become groundbreaking in the first place. Any great piece of art that can really affect you has to do that. It has to cross a line at some point. It had to create controversy. It had to provoke debate and discussion. It had to provoke all of this, between supporters and skeptics, people who think that the song has redeemable qualities and those who don't. It's actually a profoundly democratic process. Like I said, the creation of art is necessarily a social act. And so there's that kind of democracy inherently built into it. And if you think about it, it's also one that really can allow new and different art to thrive. But risk, rule-breaking, controversy, and certainly democracy are 4 things basically that corporate America can't stand. They absolutely can't do. They're all things that any money-making scheme basically needs to keep at a minimum to maintain profitability. So saying that music needs to be marketable is basically industry code for imposing a limit on the scope of art, when a limit is actually the one thing that art can't have if it's going to reach its potential. Whether it's political or not, I'm talking about art in general right now. Art simply does not respond to boundaries, or at least it doesn't respond to them well. So this is the reality of recording music in capitalism, in a system that puts profit ahead of human need. Does this mean, however, that there is simply no hope for good art or good music in the here and now? Of course not. Otherwise none of us would be in this room today. We all know of artists who are able to make different, meaningful music independently of the major labels, be it on an indie label or over the internet or just by themselves. And we can think of a good amount of artists even who have been able to release interesting and relevant music even on a major label. Like Rage Against the Machine, like The Clash. Plenty of artists that were, Public Enemy. The list goes on and on and on. So this leaves a big question at the same time. How is it that some socially conscious artists actually get a hearing and can sell a bunch of albums and become names out there, while others don't? And I think there's a lot of subjective factors in answering that kind of question, really too many to even consider. But just like we can't ignore that there are very real limits that are placed on music, that the system basically attempts to impose on them, we can't ignore that those same limits can be broken. When they are, they're likely tied to a challenge against the whole social order at large. And I don't think that's a coincidence. Remember, like I said earlier, it's the same system. The same system that exploits music exploits all of us, exploits most people. So challenging one form of exploitation, of course, this is the logic of solidarity, effectively means that we have to challenge all forms of it. In eras that appear to be relatively peaceful, where profits are high and governments appear to have everything under control, when things just seem peaceful, once again, music that protests or breaks the mold can be more easily ignored. In times of crisis, however, like the one we are currently living in, when people fight back, then they start to question things that we're actually brought up to take for granted, that we're taught to take for granted. Like, why does our economy have to be dominated by a small elite? Or, why do some have so much while the rest of us have so little? These are the questions that have brought people out onto the streets in support of Occupy and in support of the Egyptian Revolution and things like that across the whole planet. And I think these questions actually have their counterparts in culture during times like these also. Questions like, how is it that MTV has the gall to play, music videos that basically revel in privilege while I'm out of a job? Or why is it that the rich can pay millions to have Beyonce sing at their daughter's Sweet 16 party while I could get prosecuted for downloading one single song? These are some of the questions that I think can go along with basically starting to not necessarily just take everything at face value in the society that we live in. I mean, you start to question these things, and it basically means you're open to ideas and concepts, including artistic concepts that maybe you weren't open to before. The space for new, daring, even subversive art during times of crisis and fight back, once again, I think expands. And in turn, artists themselves can start to gain the confidence to test their own boundaries. This is happening. I think this is happening on a large scale right now. These are times like the 1960s, once again, when walls can be broken down, both literally and figuratively, and art can start to take really big, giant leaps forward. And there's countless examples of this, of artists who dare to break the mold because they're given the confidence, as individuals and as artists, by a broader radicalization among ordinary people in society. I mean, for example, we're all told that Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit was a protest against lynching back in the 1930s. What we're not told is that the lyrics for that song were written by Abel Meeropol, who was a member of the Communist Party. And he was also active in the New York City Teachers Union. He was a steadfast anti-racist, and he was involved in protesting the imprisonment of the Scottsboro Boys, who were 9 young black men who were on Alabama's death row. Holiday herself was a supporter of the Scottsboro campaign, and that's one of the reasons that she recorded the song. It was certainly still a brave move. I mean, we need to actually take this into consideration that in the 1930s, for a black woman to sing an anti-lynching song could result in her getting lynched herself, even in cities in the North. But because there was a movement on the ground that was opposing segregation, that was opposing the violence of American racism, she had the social space to record what has ended up being one of the most historically significant pieces of American music, period, by any standards. In many ways, this was just sort of the beginning of the connection between the civil rights movement and jazz. Often I think, especially for our generation, we're taught about jazz in such this stodgy, conservative, uptight way, like it's old people music and stuff like that. Like, really, jazz? My grandmother listens to big band. Like, why is it relevant to us today? And that's because we're not taught that the greatest jazz musicians were also revolutionaries, not only artistically, but politically for many of them. We're not taught that bebop innovators like Dizzy Gillespie, like Charlie Mingus, they themselves considered themselves communists. They considered themselves revolutionaries and radicals, and certainly considered themselves anti-racists. We're not taught about John Coltrane dedicating songs to Emmett Till. We're not taught that he stood up against the Vietnam War and spoke out against it. We're not taught about Max Roach and Abby Lincoln's Freedom Suite or any of these incredible songs. We're not taught that as the civil rights movement became more militant and outwardly revolutionary and started to morph into the Black Power movement in the 1960s, So did jazz become more experimental and started getting more aesthetically far out. And it wasn't just jazz, was it? It was rock. It was soul. It was R&B. It was the beginnings of funk and even what would become hip-hop later on down the line. I mean, it was artists like Sun Ra, Archie Shepp, Nina Simone, the MC5. John Lennon and Yoko Ono were openly identifying themselves as revolutionary socialists at this point in time in the 1970s. Because by 1970, it's a process that Tariq Ali describes as the entire culture had become radicalized. By 1970, you had 1 million Americans identifying themselves as revolutionaries and millions more who believed that they would see a revolution in the United States in their lifetime. And that mood, that revolution in the air, so to speak, is what created the space for a revolution in aesthetics, in art, in music. And it wasn't just in music. It happened in poetry, it happened in drama, it happened in filmmaking, it happened in all forms of art. But especially, once again, I feel like what sticks with us is the most is the music, for all the reasons that I said earlier. Now, it's important to point out that this wasn't just some clean wooden process. At times, it wasn't even consciously a political process. Rather, I think the lining up of art and activism with each other, I think it's more organic. And I think it's more dialectical. It's not like the kind of thing that activists can force to happen. Once again, like I said, when the narrow boundaries of democracy under capitalism are tested by a grassroots movement, it opens up the space for freedom of expression, including in art and music. Now, this isn't to say, at the same time, just because it's an organic process, that there can't be, cultural activist groups out there. I mean, quite the opposite. Obviously, I'm here today as a member of the Occupy Chicago Rebel Arts Collective, so that I think that these kinds of organizations should exist, and once again, that they have a role to play. But it is to say that if we expect the aesthetic revolution, so to speak, a term I'm using kind of loosely, to always take the lead of the political revolution, I think we'll end up getting neither. There's actually two really excellent examples since the 1960s of sort of cultural activist groups that were able to mobilize large amounts of artists and musicians to support a real struggle on the ground. And that's why they were able to be effective. The first is Rock Against Racism in the United Kingdom back in the 1970s. The second is Artists United Against Apartheid in the mid-'80s here in the United States. Rock Against Racism started out basically as a couple radical artists in London publishing a letter of protest against, of all people, Eric Clapton. In 1976, this may be shocking to some people who like Clapton's music. In 1976, Clapton, he took the stage in Birmingham, England, at a show. He was a little drunk, evidently, and he basically went off on this drunken, racist tirade from the stage. He said that Britain was about to become a black colony. That the government should, quote, get the foreigners out, get the wogs out, get the coons out. And he shouted over and over again, keep Britain white, keep Britain white. By the way, Eric Clapton has yet to apologize for these comments, like 35 years later. So, yeah, just worth keeping in mind. Yeah. And of course, there's an obvious hypocrisy here, isn't it? Because if for no other reason than Eric Clapton has made a mint off of black music himself, right? I mean, his career was floundering until he covered I Shot the Sheriff. Not to mention that his entire catalog is basically blues and R&B. Yep. Not only was it hypocritical, but it was actually quite seriously... What's that? No, anyway, not only was it hypocritical, but it was actually quite dangerous. At the time in the 1970s in Britain, there was this deep economic recession like there is today. Unemployment was very high, and there were both mainstream politicians and, more fringe sort of political groups out on the streets blaming immigrants for all of their problems, including the National Front. We'll have some discussion a little later about it, but there was a group called the National Front that was out there who were, they were basically a fascist gang. They were attempting to get they also ran in elections and things like that, but their big thing was street protests, like protests against, anti-mugging protests where they would literally have on their banners that 9 out of 10 muggers are black. And they were starting to actually gain in elections in not just in some of the far-flung backwaters in Britain, but really all over the whole country. But there was also sort of a fight back that was brewing against this kind of racism. There were strikes there were large strikes of workers that involved heavily immigrant workforces, like at Grunwick's. There were large protests against racial violence. After one Asian youth named Altab Ali was killed in 1978, the entire borough of Tower Hamlets basically went on strike in London. Groups like the Campaign Against Racism and Fascism and the Anti-Nazi League were being formed too. And so it was in this mood of this sort of brewing resistance, this brewing struggle and fight between these two sides, that Roger Huddle and Red Saunders, who were these two radicals I mentioned earlier, drafted an open letter to Clapton that called him out and called for the formation of a movement that would fight racism in music and on the streets. And the letter also signed off with what I think is one of the best written lines ever, in my opinion. P.S. Who shot the sheriff, Eric? It sure as hell wasn't you. Just really sticking it to him. So basically that's how Rock Against Racism was born. It was also profoundly well-timed and well thought out. Not only was it tapping into this anger among working class kids that was best expressed in punk rock at the time, the Clash, the Sex Pistols, X-Ray Specs, but it also recruited ska and reggae artists, very importantly, because Britain, as people may know, has a very large Caribbean immigrant community. And most importantly, every chance they got, they used Rock Against Racism concerts to urge young people to become activists, to join the movement. Their slogan was reggae, soul, rock and roll, jazz, funk, punk, our music. It basically, if music had been turned into a battleground, then they basically were drawing a line in the sand, Rock Against Racism, and saying you're either against racism or you're not. There is no gray area here. And that goes for youth in general and for musicians. And within a couple of years, Rock Against Racism had basically grown to the point where they were able to draw 80,000 people to fill up Victoria Park in London, which is a huge park. I've been there. It's massive. To hear The Clash, Steel Pulse, X-Ray Specs, and others at what was openly built as a carnival against the Nazis after an anti-fascist demo. It was an open anti-racist festival that played off the fact that music, once again, because it was an inherently social act, also had to be a necessarily multiracial and multicultural act. And it used that to change young people's ideas. And in Britain, it's still actually looked at as one of the defining moments of contemporary British music. But the movement was a key factor. I want to emphasize that. If there hadn't been essential, on-the-ground, anti-racist activism from different groups, various unions, then RAR, I think, would have seemed kind of abstract. It wouldn't have had, rooting in the reality around it. It might not have had the traction to catch on the way it really did, and we might not have really even heard about it today. Now, the other example I'd like to talk about, as I said, is Artists United Against Apartheid. This is from about a decade later, in 1986. It was the height of Reaganism, the height of conservatism in the United States, the Cold War, but it was also the height of the anti-apartheid movement, the movement against South African legalized segregation. And it was a movement that was struggling in solidarity with the black majority in South Africa, occupying campuses, campaigning for companies and countries to divest and set up sanctions, boycotting those that refused, and of course boycotting South Africa itself. Now, there was already a UN call for the boycott of South Africa, which of course the US was ignoring at the time because Reagan was in power. But culturally, South Africa was still able to host these concerts with international acts, actually, that were in big violation of sanctions by claiming that the territory in northern South Africa called Bophuthatswana, it was somehow an independent state, according to the South African government, and so they could somehow hold events there. The reality, of course, was that Bophuthatswana was a Bantustan. It was one of the areas where South Africa was forcibly relocating its black population. But because South Africa was claiming that somehow it was an independent territory, they were able to book artists, despite the boycott, in the Sun City Casino, which is right in the center. Artists United Against Apartheid was formed in response to this. It was initially the brainchild of Steven Van Zandt, who's Bruce Springsteen's guitarist in the E Street Band, and Danny Schechter, who's a progressive journalist who still appears on ZNet today. Both wanted to make it clear that apartheid was apartheid, hands down, no what-ifs, no exceptions, and apartheid does not deserve to be entertained. What they did was, basically in cooperation with many anti-apartheid groups in the U.S., they sought out participation from musicians to publicly declare in song that they wouldn't play anywhere in South Africa or in Bophuthatswana. The song that they came out with was named Sun City, and it featured Van Zandt, Springsteen, Jimmy Cliff, Keith Richards, Miles Davis, Gil Scott-Heron, Bonnie Raitt, George Clinton. It's also important to point out at this point that this was the 1980s when MTV was still very, very slow to play any hip-hop. And if they played hip-hop videos, they were normally late at night, they were on off hours and things like that. But Sun City, Van Zandt and Schechter, they made sure to include Run DMC on the recording, as well as Grandmaster Melly Mel, DJ Kool Herc, Curtis Blow, Africa Bambaataa, and actually they started the track off, the hip-hop artist, which I think is a very strong statement in and of itself to make in the middle of Reagan America, especially when hip-hop was, and still is to a degree, very much hounded in this profoundly racist manner. The end result wasn't just a very dynamic song, and it was a great song. You can go online and listen to it, and it bridged the gap between jazz, rock, rap, pop, but it also became something of an informational rallying point for the anti-apartheid movement. Throughout the whole movement, there had been these elements, peripheral or outside of it, that claimed to be sympathetic, but in one way or another said that maybe there should be exceptions made to the boycott in one way or another. Sun City said no, said absolutely no. They put the struggle at the center of the song and said, this is a picket line, we're not crossing it, and neither should you. Hands down, it's as simple as that. And in doing so, I would argue, because it provided that kind of informational talking point and sort of lightning rod for the rest of the anti-apartheid movement, it became a really crucial tool. Now, neither of these examples were on the level of the 1930s or the 1960s, when the whole culture had become radicalized. The level of struggle in the 1970s and 1980s was notably lower. These were periods of reaction, conservatism. But because both of the respective groups, Artists Against Apartheid and Rock Against Racism, were tapped into and taking the lead from an on-the-ground movement, they were able to reach a wider audience. In turn, they galvanized the movement. Each one also, I would say, helped carve out a platform of legitimacy that might not have gotten it otherwise for certain genres of music. In the case of Rock Against Racism, it was punk rock. In the case of Artists United Against Apartheid, it was hip-hop, like I said earlier. And what we can learn from this is that mass movements don't only provide the opportunity for artists to speak out, but in opening up the space to do so, they can push forward and create new possibilities for musicians, for artists, for music itself. In other words, the exploitation of music can be lessened, alleviated, or at least shaken up so that music can reestablish a semblance of its independence, so that it has fewer rules that are trying to keep it back and hold it back in chains. But it can only do so through engaging in struggle. It's something that I think we are starting to see take form today, once again on a very large scale, even outside the ranks of Occupy. The outpouring of anger and protest around the murder of Trayvon Martin has unsurprisingly spread across all kinds of artistic realms, in particular the hip-hop community. I mean, Nas, Jaziri X, Mr. Fab, The Game, Young Jeezy, David Banner. Once again, this isn't surprising. Hip-hop has always responded to incidents like this, be it Rodney King, Sean Bell, so on and so forth, because of the roots, the conditions that gave rise to hip-hop are still there. And the difference now, however, is that the level of anger is so palpable, the level of outrage and protest is so palpable and unavoidable, and it's starting to pour into the streets so much, even through its ebbs and flows, that new movements and organizations, I think, can start to take hold. They can really start to reach a higher level, and that goes for art too. Now, this once again does not mean that all music has to be outwardly political. I actually think the world would be boring as hell if all art had to be political, if there were no room for love songs or songs just about the human emotional state, right? What it is to say, however, is that there's room for all types of artists in the fight for a fundamentally different world. And activists, I think we stand to gain something by having an eye towards organizing artists into the same fight. Why? Well, because artists themselves have a stake in doing so for all the reasons that I laid out earlier. One of my favorite things to say is that art may be a labor of love, but it's still labor of a kind. In other words, artists, with relatively few exceptions, are workers. They are part of the 99%, part of the working class, and they have an objective interest in fighting against corporate power, against forms of oppression, war, and exploitation. And I think what this means for Occupy is that for the cultural momentum that we established earlier on, that I said at the beginning of this talk, is something that we need to build on. Part of the question is already in place if you think about it. We've already seen countless musicians from across the spectrum come out in support of this movement. And we need to ask ourselves, how can we further mobilize artists against foreclosures, evictions, against police brutality, union busting, war, empire, and all the rest? But we also need to ask another question that I don't think has been really brought up yet. And that is, what can Occupy as a movement actually do for artists? Not just what can artists do for this movement, but what can the movement bring to them? And I think there's actually some very material suggestions to make. Protesting the shutdown of community art centers, is one of the things that we can do. Supporting artists' attempt to unionize, as well as those to keep their jobs. Back in January, I don't know if people heard, but the New York City Opera locked out its performers and musicians. They were forced back to work for a few days later with an agreement that, from my understanding, was pretty awful. It basically was somewhere like a 60% pay cut for all the musicians. This is the New York City Opera, which was once had this nickname of being the People's Opera in New York City. Set up with public funds, too, back in the 40s. Now, I have no idea whether Occupy Wall Street took the effort to sort of reach out to the locked out workers, but they definitely should have, if not. And it's for that same reason that I think here in Chicago in particular, that we need to be supporting the teachers' struggle. I mean, art and music teachers, they're the first ones laid off when they try to go privatize schools and when they try to replace them with charters. When they try to bust teachers' unions, they go after the arts teachers and the music teachers the first. And, we all know, it's common knowledge that a good, robust public education has to include the arts. It has to include music. Because, who knows how many talented kids might not otherwise get the opportunity to discover that creative talent, if not in the schools. Now, I think we also need to be looking at this in a broader scale. I think we need to be supporting artists who are making the decision to boycott Israel right now. There's a lot of propaganda that is thrown around nowadays in the mainstream media saying that artists like Elvis Costello, the Pixies, Roger Waters, Cat Power, all of whom have canceled shows in protest in Israel, are misguided, that they're somehow caving into anti-Semitism and things like that. No, it is nothing of the sort. This is a legitimate call for cultural boycott of a colonial apartheid state, and it's modeled on the movement against South African apartheid that I mentioned earlier, another colonial apartheid state. And it's a call coming from the majority of Palestinian society. It's also supported by a great many of the young people who are striving for democracy in the Middle East in general, particularly in Egypt. They struggle in solidarity with the Palestinian people and against the occupation. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism or religion. It basically has to do, this is an oppressed people who have set up a picket line in the struggle against their own oppression, and they're asking that the world honor it. And when they do so, well, we do so. And I think Occupy Chicago can play a role in supporting artists who choose to observe the cultural boycott. Likewise, throughout the world, there are these vibrant music scenes struggling alongside workers, pro-democracy movements that deserve our solidarity. In the initial days of the uprising in Tunisia, that really set this whole chain of events into motion, one can argue. One of the young people singled out by the cops was a rapper named El General in the city of Sfax. And he was basically arrested for the crime of recording and releasing a song that was critical of the government, of the Ben Ali regime. An international defense campaign was launched. His video went viral for that song in particular. I was playing that song before people came in, and he was released a few days later as a result of the International Solidarity Campaign. Last year, El General was named one of Time Magazine's most influential people in the world, which is pretty impressive if you think about it, considering that about a year before, no one, even in Tunisia, knew who he was. And now he's basically become the soundtrack of a revolution. And there are cases like that of El General all over the world, well beyond the Arab regions, too. In Russia, 3 women have been, who are connected with the feminist punk collective Pussy Riot, have been locked up because the band Pussy Riot is a vocal ally of the movement against Vladimir Putin, the pro-democracy movement that sprung up this past winter after the rigged elections. These 3 women face up to 7 years in jail just for possibly being affiliated with the Pussy Riot performance. And there was talk of trying to pull something together here in Chicago for today, actually, because today is a day that's been called an International Solidarity with the women of Pussy Riot. Never really quite materialized, and I think actually what that emphasizes is that we need more people to join cultural activist groups like OCRAC, because we have way too much work and too few people to really pull it off. And these are just some of the examples. I think there's a lot of possibilities that are worth exploring, discussing, debating out, but we need to get the balance right. Once again, we need to get that sort of dialectic there. And I'll wrap up on this. I'll just say that, like, if we don't recognize the constantly shifting nexus between art, politics, culture, then I think we're going to miss some very choice opportunities to grow and deepen ourselves as a movement. I was talking earlier about this point, my art is my activism. I think your activism has to be your activism, because there's no substitute for it, for putting together the brass tacks that enable real boots to be put on the ground, to push the struggle forward. But because that's when people start to really, when their ideas really start to change, and you don't want to put the cart before the horse. That being said, I truly hope it's clear that we can't just leave it at that we can't ignore the other side of the coin and say that art has no role to play in social struggle. It's not so much unrealistic as it is dogmatic, and once again, boring as fuck. I mean, does anyone here really want to be part of a struggle, be part of a movement that only survives on these rote ideas or dry economics or statistics and theories? I mean, that sounds utterly droll to me. I have no interest in being part of that kind of movement. It's like that commonly that quote that's commonly misattributed to Emma Goldman: "If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution." Goldman didn't actually say those words. It's little known, but the words are still true. We need forms of expression that hit us on that emotional level that intellectual ideas simply can't reach. It's something fundamental to human existence, and I think we have a right to it. There's a slogan from a strike of women textile workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts, a strike that recently celebrated its 100th anniversary. And the slogan is, "We want bread and roses too." And I think it's a very powerful, simple statement, because basically what it puts out there is that we don't just have a right to the basic things that keep us alive. Housing, food, healthcare, employment. We have a right to all the beautiful things in life too. We have a right to create the things that feed the soul as well as just fill our bellies, because I think in a truly just world, we'd have both. And so I'll wrap it up there.
The preceding program was a production of wearemany.org, a website dedicated to publishing radical and activist media that promotes a better understanding of today's world while also putting forward a vision for a better future. We Are Many is a project of the Center for Economic Research and Social Change. To learn more about this program or to find others like it, check out wearemany.org.